Okay, well today we're going to continue our story. Eventually we will get all the way through the book of Revelation, but it'll be a while. And we're going to talk about Zaphnath-Paneah in Egypt. Pardon me? Well, I hope you learned who that guy is. Zaphnath-Paneah. Zaphnath. Have you ever heard that story in the Bible? You haven't? Well, stay with me a while. I think maybe you have. You just didn't know the guy by that name, because really we're talking about Joseph. We talked about Joseph last week in his relationship with his father and with his brothers as they're growing up. And today we'll be studying the life of him and what happened when he finally makes it to Egypt. Now, I was about 20 years old at the time of the Camp David Accord. Do you remember those meetings in history? Yeah, I remember that. I mean, monumental. Just the fact that you could get these two guys to come together and sit in the same room together was just completely, totally amazing. And there were actually two of these meetings, and these were conducted over a period of 12 days at Camp David. The meeting was called to jumpstart an effort that had started but had stalled to get peace between Israel and Palestine. Between Egypt and Palestine. The PLO was causing trouble there, I'm sure. And he brought these two guys in, the head of Israel, the head of Egypt, and the PLO really wanted to be there as well. And they were really angry that they weren't invited. But nonetheless, they weren't. These two guys hammered out an agreement that put peace really between them. And all my life, I guess, this was the time of the most harmony, I believe, between those two warring nations. They still are at war with each other, and with the rest of the world too in some cases. Was the Lord with Begin and with Sadat and with Carter when this meeting happened? I believe he was. I believe the Lord was pushing the dominoes around on the table a little bit and getting these three guys at least to come together. It really was a spectacle, an amazing thing that happened, an unusual thing. Well, how many times does the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph, occur in Genesis chapter 39? I'm sure you've got it all memorized, and you can go back through and count it up. But in case you don't, I'll share with you how many times. So in verse 2, the Lord was with God so that he prospered. In verse 3, he gave him success in everything Joseph did. Verse 21, he was there and showed kindness and granted Joseph favor and gave him success in whatever he did. The Lord was with him, there's no doubt. Now, when the Lord is with you, a word we sometimes use is providence. And in my house, if you say the word Providence, my mother-in-law will start talking about, oh, I remember living in Providence when I was a little kid, and I grew up there, and I really get tired of hearing about Providence. One of these days, I'm going to make it up there north of Searcy to find out what Providence is all about. I have a feeling today it's nothing but just a little community and some old rundown ransacked buildings and farmland that used to be farmland, maybe. I don't know. But that's Providence. God's providence was with Joseph when he was there making things happen for him when he was a young child with his 11 brothers at home. Later, as he was a steward for Potiphar in Potiphar's home in Egypt. Providence is what we call it when God is with you. God is working for you and you don't even know it. So this is Webster's definition, having divine guidance or care. Now, it usually is referred to in reference to God. You think about that, right? But we also are provident, and we make plans for our children, for instance, when they're growing up. We have care and concern for them, and we're with them whether we're with them or not. Physically, we are with them and mentally, and we're planning for them. We're hoping that they will have a great future. Now, Joseph himself was a providential man. Pharaoh gave him the opportunity to run the food bank that's going to establish help that Egypt's going to need to weather a 7-year drought. And he planned for the eventuality for 7 years. Then he got to implement that plan that he put in place. That is providence. That's God putting Joseph in place to help a complete nation weather a 7-year drought. Looking forward and making provisions for the future. You can just see God's providence in the story, I'm sure, if you think back on it. The good things and the bad things that happened to him in his life, all of that worked together for good for Joseph and also then for Egypt. Is God with us like he was with Joseph today? Can you look back on your life and see evidence of God's providence? His caring and his concern for you? I mean, obviously, we think back on him sending his son. That was providential care beyond belief. But on a day-to-day basis, is he with you in the car when you're driving, when you're going home, when you're coming to church? I mean, is God with us as he was with Joseph in that day? The Bible says all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. That's Romans chapter 8, according to the Apostle Paul. He didn't say some things. He didn't say a few things. He says all things. I'm thinking he meant everything that happens to us, every breath we take. You know, everything that happens to us, God is there working his will according to his purpose for us. Sometimes what we get is not quite what we expect, right? And in those times we have to understand and see that as something being for our own good. We can't understand why we didn't get that job that we wanted, or, you know, why we were turned down for this, that. We don't understand. But if we don't realize that everything works out for our own good, according to what the Bible says, we suffer from undue anxiety and stress from getting something that you didn't expect or not getting something that you hoped for. Anyway, imagine all the events in your life that led you to being here in this room on this day. Any number of things could have kept that from happening. Was anything in all of that out of your control? Certainly, there were things that happened that were out of your control. Let me use an example of Jenny's not here today. I wish she had been, because I found the car that she and her mother and her father and her sister were in when they were on a trip back in a vacation back in 1965. They were just outside the city of Denver, and they were confronted with an unfortunate turn of events. A wall of water that was 15 feet high came rushing down the lower Flat River, South Flat River, near Littleton, Colorado, just south of Denver. They were 20 miles away from that rushing flood of water that came in. And they got to this place, Deer Trail, Colorado, just in time for the water to hit and start coming into the city. They ran into a place there, a hotel, and they ran in, and the lady said, "Come on in, we're all headed up to the roof because it's going to get high." They went up on the roof and they watched their car float down the street. They didn't have time to unpack it. Everything they had was with them, and that car floated down the street. It's very fortunate that they got there just at the time that they did, right? They didn't know it, but they were in Colorado's worst flood to this date today. They had no clue. Now, was it providence that Jenny and her mom and her dad and her sister were there? Was it providence that something happened to put them at just the right spot to get them to this hotel and get up on the roof at that time? We often don't realize that when we're in the middle of things. I doubt Jimmy was thinking about providence at all when he looked at his car floating down the road. Did God have anything to do with that? Now, before you answer, we'll get further into this lesson and we'll talk about whether God has anything to do with those kinds of things that happen in our lives and we just don't recognize it. Imagine an old Jewish grandfather. The little boy here would have known him as Zeta. Zeta, tell me about that story about Joseph. The story of Joseph so far had gone well, obviously. God's dream showed him how things would turn out, and eventually everything's going fine for Joseph, even when he was sold as a slave, until Potiphar's wife comes on the scene. Now, we know how she pursued the young Israelite and how he deflected all of her advances until she got exasperated with Zaphanath and decided then to lie to her husband about him. And at this very point in the story, Potiphar was about to put Joseph in prison. And this little boy's looking at his grandfather thinking, you're talking about the father of the race of the Jews. How in the world are we going to get past this? What's going to happen? He's going to go to prison and get killed? Can't you sense, I guess, the tension that was beginning to build in this story for this little child until the end of it all is read? Now, is there anything in chapter 39 that might seem like God's providence was not with Joseph at some times? You know the story. Think of some things that would indicate, in a way, Joseph could think, wow, why isn't God helping me with this now? He sent me here, but look what's happened to me. Well, I know you don't like to talk in class, so I wrote some things down for you. Potiphar's wife, first of all, lied to her husband about the job that Joseph was doing. Totally got Potiphar's mind changed around about who Joseph was. And at the same time, there was nobody else in the house that came to Joseph's defense. No one would stand up against Potiphar. And finally, Potiphar threw Joseph in prison. Now, can you just imagine? God's promised you things. His fortune has been with you so far, but now I'm in prison looking out these barred walls. How's that going to work out, God? Does God work in our lives? Is He working in your lives this very day? Do you really believe this verse, that all things work together for good? If we do, why in the world do we worry? Why would we worry about anything? If God is there and He is providing for us through everything. Here are some truths about God's providence for us. We think of it as only God doing only good things for us, things that we agree with. It was fortunate if God caused that to happen. But what about the bad things that happen? Is it providence that your home gets flooded or your car gets washed down the road? Someone in your family dies? Is it providence that you make a mistake on your taxes, which I did a few years ago? All of it's grouped under the question, why do bad things happen to good people? If all things that happen work together for good, then that doesn't mean just the good things. If all means all, it also means the bad things. And they're truly accidents that happen. I probably think we shouldn't attribute anything to what we consider to be luck. Should we believe in luck? Or is God directing everything that's going to happen to us for some reason? Nor would we really believe that an accident ever had happened. All things, according to what Romans tells us, happen because God is directing them to happen. Even the bad things, I look back on my life and all the bad things, like the lesson I learned when I made a mistake on my taxes. I'm not going to make that mistake again. And it worked to my benefit, and it was good for me. Even the bad things have a way of turning out to be good. I didn't get jobs that I wanted. Probably that was a blessing that I should be glad about instead of the jobs that I actually did find out about. Consider this. In Ruth's story, did you know that Ruth was just walking and just happened to find herself in Boaz's field? That's the way the Bible puts it. She just happened to come to the field of Boaz. Now, if she'd happened to come to another field and never met Boaz, things would have turned out totally different for her. But God made sure that those events happened. Does that kind of work in our lives today? I'm being convinced the older I get that it does. That God's providence is with us. But that doesn't always mean good things. Sometimes bad things happen. And they happen for a reason. Okay, enough about that. So let's move on with the story. Who is Potiphar? Well, he was a guy that had been put over everything in Egypt. He wasn't the Pharaoh, but he was a high-ranking official. We know that his name means has the word Ra in it. So it's something to do with Ra. Potiphar means that he was dedicated to Ra since his birth. It's as if we had the word Heavenly Father in our name. or God, perhaps, in our name. Well, he was the captain of the guard. He was in the Egyptian army, but he was in the corps that functioned as the state police. He really was the chief police officer for the entire nation of of Egypt at that time. His job was to protect the ruler, of course. He also was to control peace and domestic violence. So it would make sense then that he would be the one that was managing the prison system. Now, some believe because of the office that he held that he was a eunuch. That was the case with some people who worked in an official capacity for the Pharaoh. And it's possible that he was a eunuch. But again, it's also possible that he may not have been. If so, it was uncommon for eunuchs to have wives or even a harem. And it would be impossible for him, of course, to have children. But if this were true, that he was a eunuch, doesn't it make the idea that his wife pursued Joseph as much as she did? It kind of gives a little credence to the possibility that he was a eunuch, which would not have been out of the ordinary. Now, I realize the idea of a butler generally comes to us from our history. In the popular TV series, what was the name of that thing? I can't remember. I wrote it, Downton Abbey. We follow this butler around a lot, don't we? And this butler actually managed more than the owner of this estate did. He managed virtually everything. He took care of the staff, the workers. He hired and fired them. He was in charge of the personal needs of everybody in the family. He was in charge of the official responses to all correspondence. I remember when the phone came in, and he hated it because anybody could pick up on the phone and not just him. He was the keeper of the schedules of everything that happened. Essentially, he was the estate manager over their household, including managing the financial accounts for the family. This would have been Joseph. He would have been this butler. The Bible describes him as well-built and handsome. So I went to Google and I typed in well-built and handsome. And I'll show you some of the pictures that I got. Do you picture Joseph looking anything like that? No, right? Very seldom do we see people who look like this, right? There are a few of them out there, but you only see them on Google, perhaps, I guess. I don't know. But the term may have meant something a little bit different in Joseph's time, but I'm sure it didn't mean, I'm going to get this thing off here because it's even nasty to look at, right? So here's the Bible's description of Joseph, and the pictures that we have here are probably pretty much what I think. I think of him as a healthy 17-year-old kid, certainly not muscly like those other guys were. A pretty healthy kid, 17, 18 years old. He certainly was capable. I mean, it tells us of how he managed the flocks and so forth. He was virtuous, meaning that he valued virtue in all of his actions and would never have acted the way that he was charged to have acted by Potiphar's wife. He was hardworking, no doubt, certainly effective in planning all of the efforts that were going on. A handsome, well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife saw him, was very attracted to him, and made all kinds of advances at him. She probably saw him as a tempting diversion, and she was relentless in her pursuit, so much that Joseph tried to put as much space between him and her as he could. Finally, he told Potiphar's wife, "How could I even think of betraying my master in such a way? You are his property, you're not mine. I've been entrusted with everything I have that you have in this palace, except you. It would be a sin for me to do as you want me to do." Well, of course, she didn't sit very well with it, but the question I have is this: is it a sin to be tempted? Well, thankfully, we'd be asking God's forgiveness just about in everything, wouldn't we? TV commercial comes on, and a glass of milk can be tempting to you. It is not a sin to be tempting. It's only after we yield to our lusts that it becomes a sin. We're commanded to walk in the Spirit, not in the flesh, but if the flesh is so often in our face these days, just remember, to be tempted is not a sin. Acting upon that temptation, though, is a sin. So what was going on in Joseph's mind? Beautiful woman comes to him. All of these thoughts that are listed here were in his mind. Each of you probably has been tempted, as Joseph was in some way, possibly about something other than sex perhaps, but fibbing a bit on the taxes, whatever. Here's a list of 7 deadly sins. These are things we struggle with, right? The whole compendium of them could be grouped in pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Now, the things that bring us there, not themselves are sin. But when you act this way, that's when sin enters the picture. So what did Joseph decide? He had these thoughts. She'll never tell. It'll be discreet. What if I don't do it? Wow. Think how gorgeous she is. Who's going to know? I'll be protected. She'll never give anything up in what happens in all of this, right? There's a whole lot of things Joseph would be pinning his thoughts on if he were to have done what the woman wanted him to do. How did he decide? If you don't know, I'll tell you. She'd never tell? Well, it doesn't matter. God would still know. It'll be discreet. Well, he's going to find out, right? He's the guy that has all of the intelligence for this whole nation of Israel. Surely he would find out what went on. What if I don't do it? But what if I do? I'll regret it forever. She's beautiful, no doubt, but she doesn't belong to me. She belongs to my master. Who's going to know? God. She and I will know forever. Hopefully, Potiphar will never find out, but Potiphar would probably know. I'll be protected, but she can't be trusted. She would own me forever, and then I must flee right now. So what did she do? Well, he fled, and as he was getting away, she grabbed his cloak and hung on to it, and he ran out of it so he could get away from her. First thing she did was bring that story to her servants to try it out and make sure it sounded good. I took the Hebrew in, and look, he's made sport of us. He tried to assault me. I screamed, and he ran. She told Potiphar the same story and showed him the cloak, and Potiphar then burned with anger, just like any of us men would do. And Joseph was found. He was put in prison, and the place where the king's prisoners were confined is where Joseph found himself. Now, while he was there, he was very successful. God granted him favor. His life was a little bit cushy. He even eventually became the manager of the prison area. He took care of the day-to-day workings and goings on of the prison. That's because he was so capable a manager. And he became friends with a couple of inmates, right? Well, the first was a cupbearer for the Pharaoh. Now, this was a high-profile position. The Pharaoh depended upon him. It'd be so easy for someone to sneak poison into whatever I'm drinking. And the cupbearer's job was to take a sip of everything, wait a little while, and if he didn't die, then I'll go ahead and drink the wine. That's how neurotic he would have been because of the possibility of someone trying to kill him that way. Well, Joseph interpreted a dream for him that he was squeezing grapes in the Pharaoh's wine cup, told him, you're going to be released and you'll go back to your earlier job. And Joseph then asked for help later, and as it came to pass, Joseph predicted it, but he didn't remember Joseph at that time. The baker's dream wasn't quite so nice. The baker's dream, he saw crows coming and eating bread that he had just baked that had been stacked on his head for some reason. You'd think he'd be carrying it out, but he had it up on his head. Anyway, the crows indicated to Joseph that Pharaoh was going to lift off your head and impale your body on a pole. And the birds are going to come, but they're going to be eating you instead of the meat. And that happened just as Joseph said. We know that 2 years go by. Pharaoh himself has a dream. He saw 7 fat cows that were swallowed by 7 scrawny cows and 7 fat heads of wheat and so forth. But the cupbearer finally came through and said, I remember this guy named Joseph. He brought Joseph in. Joseph told him all about what was going to happen. There's going to be 7 years of fat and 7 years of lean. Get ready now, and you'll be ready for that when it happens. He put Joseph in charge of everything. Wealth beyond measure, fortune beyond he could ever hope for, and leadership of everything in Egypt. He was the second in command. That's when his name got changed, Zapnath-Paneah, and he was a savior of the age and a secret revealer, and the one who was known as being the one who stores up. Joseph has a wife that was given to him. Her name is Asenath. They have 2 children, Manasseh and Ephraim. And those 2 children we recognize as being half children because they weren't true Israelites in their lineage. but nonetheless they were considered children of Israel. All of these stories in the Old Testament can be helpful to us, even in the 21st century. They can serve as warnings and examples to us not to encourage in those same behaviors that we're reading about. Wonderful Bible stories. They can warn us of what we should do in our world today. Any questions?